Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today. My name is Andrea Schweitzer, and I'm the Research Services Librarian at the University of Manitoba Libraries. And I'd just like to introduce my colleague on this presentation today, Natalie Villefort. She is our digital curation archivist. Natalie, want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. I'll be monitoring the chat and questions if anyone has any questions throughout.
So I know some of you have attended our presentation last week in preparing for deposit your thesis in MSpace, and we got some really great questions last week. And so we really look forward to taking this opportunity to carrying that conversation with respect to other types of deposit, um, namely data as well as any kind of scholarly output outside of a thesis. So please start your questions now by putting them in the question box. And when we get to the question part of our presentation, Natalie and I will start answering them in order that we receive them. And we're really hoping that you'll, during that time, be encouraged to release your mic and talk to us directly so we can have more of a dynamic conversation. So with that, we're going to get started. So the purpose of today's presentation is to encourage deposit for discovery and promotion of scholarly work at the University of Manitoba. And that includes the promotion of deposit as an option or alternative to open access publishing via the gold open titles. And some of you may understand sort of gold open as sort of article processing charge titles. So deposit definitely can be an alternative. Sometimes APCs are required though, as some publishers charge for the right to deposit. And if you wish, you can talk to me more about that during the question period. And then finally, what we're going to pursue today is inform on the considerations for deposit as part of the research process. So what do you need to do before you actually go to deposit to make it as easy as possible for you? So we've presented on various different aspects of these considerations that we'll touch on today in these other presentations. So I really encourage you to check out our YouTube channel on these presentations because it does get into in a more depth on things like Creative Commons licenses, data management plans, topics around deposit and its relationship to open publishing. And Natalie has done an excellent presentation on data deposit, particular considerations about preservation and retention and all those kinds of considerations there. So if you need more information about any of those topics that we'll talk about a little bit here, we really encourage you to explore those. So I framed the presentation today using the 3 W's and an H. And so these are the questions that you can ask yourself to help you prepare. So first of all, what are you going to deposit? And so here are 3 questions around what that you should be thinking about. So first and foremost, what discipline are you in, and or what research audience are you trying to reach? So there are many discipline repositories out there, and they can be very niche. And so if you are publishing in that niche, that may be the repository for you. In addition to the University of Manitoba repositories, because the nice thing about deposit is you can actually deposit in more than one repository. So that's one thing that you should be thinking about. The second thing around what is, oops, sorry, I jumped ahead a bit. Is it one thing, or does it have several components of different formats? And that is very important to think about because the several components doesn't necessarily have to go together with the main thing. But if it's not going to go there, how do you make sure that people understand its relationship to the thing that you're depositing? And we can talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go. And then finally, what is the version of the thing that is going to be deposited? And this is a big deal when you're talking about data curation. And if you have, as part of your research, submitted to a research ethics board, you have told the research ethics board what you will and will not be keeping and in how you're going to keep it. And so that will then, of course, influence that version. You said, yes, I'm going to keep this and I'm going to be depositing in this repository or a repository or whatever that happened, whatever you've happened to say. So the next W is, why are you going to deposit? So there's many different considerations here that that you need to keep in mind. First is the funder and publisher mandates. So more and more funders, whether it's grant specific or just as a philosophy. So for example, Welcome has a sort of generic deposit expectation. And Tri-Agency has broached the topic around entering in requirements of deposit through sort of specific grants. So for example, the rapid grant response that's currently available through Tri-Agency, that has an expectation of deposit. So if you don't have a funder mandate, you may have a publisher mandate. So PLOS has an expectation for data deposit. And unfortunately, a lot of people enter into submitting to PLOS not really knowing that that is a mandate. And then when they get to be accepted, they are asked to deposit or show evidence of deposit. And that puts a lot of people into an interesting conundrum, especially if they had not anticipated that expectation. And again, going back to sort of at the beginning of the research chain, the research cycle, if you have, and if your research has required REB, that puts you in a very interesting position around, you know, what you can and can't deposit, and what kind of retroactive mechanisms do you have to do in order to meet that mandate, or you may not, and that's another challenge. So planning ahead for these things is really important, so that when you get to the end point and you are at the deposit point, you have worked all of those things out. So data sharing, sort of as a philosophy, as an you know, that of course influences and is driving these mandates, is key. And this is part of the open scholarship principles. And evidence has shown that you may reach your audience better through deposit than the traditional publishing vehicles. And as a part of that, you want your data to be reused, because ultimately, in the end, that's why we do research. So we impact and we reach out to our fellow researchers and enable our results to be built upon for further innovation, further findings. The third W is, where are you going to deposit? So back to the funder mandates. Some funders, like NIH, for example, do stipulate which repository you should be depositing your data. So for example, there's if you do genomic research, and you have applied and received, funding from NIH, they stipulate that you are expected to demonstrate data reuse as well as contribute to data reuse by depositing your data in one of the global, I guess, and NIH supported genomic repositories. But as for a large part, those funder dictates around where you will deposit is largely still open, and the choice of repositories is very, very large. And the directory, to determine just how large it is, there's approximately 2,800 repositories that one can choose from, is found here and at this link. And 2,800 repositories is quite a large number and kind of overwhelming. So if you want someone to help you narrow that down, you can certainly talk to your liaison librarian or myself or your peers. If you have read an article and they reference a particular data sets from a particular repository, and you've used that, for example, or you're interested in that, that may be the avenue that you want to put your data. So that's one thought or consideration about how you can investigate repositories that may reach the audience you're trying to reach. The third point here is considerations and qualities of the repository. So for our both MSpace and our Dataverse repositories, we have terms of use and content parameters. So back in the early days of our repositories, especially MSpace, we sort of took everything. And as we go along and as the repository universe has expanded and now actually trying to I don't know if I want to say tighten up, but certainly provide more boundaries around content. We too are following suit with that. So it's really important that you just don't assume that you can deposit your material in our repositories. Although our content parameters are fairly wide open. And so we really encourage you to look at them as part of your planning process before you just deposit or expect to deposit, because your assumptions and the actual point at which you deposit may change quite a lot. Finally, this year, in fact, there was an article in Nature on trust. And this is a new criteria for repositories that has come out and is definitely making waves in the open scholarly world. And these are criteria that is going to form the framework for, again, on those sort of parameters I was talking about. And so you can see the five criteria categories: transparency, responsibility, use focus, sustainability, and technology. And so I'm just going to quickly click on that just to show you this article. And you may wonder why I'm showing you this, but trust and FAIR, if you've heard of FAIR principles, in terms of scholarship and data are walking together. So FAIR, if you're not familiar with that, that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we kind of touch on those principles when we talk about metadata, which I'll be talking about in a minute. And that's fine for data, but then it needs to sort of expand to include the envelopes, the vehicles, those repositories that should sort of reflect these as well. And so this is where this framework of trust comes in. And this is starting to sort of, again, formalize innovations and developments that have largely been to date just sort of more in the spirit of openness, not necessarily of sort of regulation. And so in order to allow people to trust where they put their things for long-term preservation and discovery, it's important for them to understand what the premises of those are built on, and that's where trust comes in. So you can peruse this at your leisure outside of this presentation just to sort of see what these are. And again, this is somewhat in part to help to address, unfortunately, dark side of open scholarship with, like predatory publishing and those kinds of things where unfortunately trust and the lack of regulation and structure has sort of allowed certain unsavory aspects of open to sort of flourish. And so this is, again, starts to sort of try to provide some framework and certifiability, I guess, of these various infrastructures. So the H, how are you going to deposit? So how are you going to deposit is really largely dictated on your data curation plan, your activities that you've done this way, up to the point of deposit. But if you have left your data curation to the quote last minute, don't worry. We do provide some assistance to you that way. But it's important to understand that, to understand the processes of data curation, because not everything is deposit worthy. And again, if you have submitted an REB or your research is governed by REB approval, then you have already said in sort of broad strokes what you will and will not be making available, or in what ways you'll be making that available. So other considerations outside of curation or as part of curation include copyright, and that is a license. So that gets into sort of Creative Commons licenses or other kinds of licenses that may be applied to the thing that you wish to deposit. Description, which we'll talk about a little bit more deeply here. That includes metadata as well as documentation. README files and other kinds of user documentation to promote reuse. Access, so that could include embargo, which is part of perhaps honoring a license applied to the object, or that can include restricted. So if it's restricted, that may likely be because it has some kind of identifying information as part of that data. And then, of course, the other options of open include access include open, and then the final one, of course, is metadata only, which I'm not really going to talk about, but it kind of I'll talk about it a little bit more when we get to harvesting. Anyways, in regards to retention, again, this is talked about in more depth in the data curation and data deposit presentations. And Natalie on the call today is our expert on data retention and concepts around data retention. So if you have any questions around that, she will be happy to talk about it in the question point of this presentation. But it also has some bearing around the trust principles. So not everything can be retained forever and ever, nor should it be, because there's various different kinds of preservation. So, and there's oftentimes an active part of your research post development of your research, but as time goes on, the likelihood of that activity probably gets to be decreased. So that's where you talk about sort of, dark storage or cold storage or whatever you want to talk about. And then finally, the type of deposit, and that goes back to the what. What is it you're trying to deposit? Because where you again deposit will have some bearing on what kind of what type of deposit you're trying to do. So one thing that people that maybe you're not so aware of, at least not necessarily actively thinking about until you sort of point it out, is that repositories are like the whole point of why they exist is to be discovered. They are essentially oceans or pools of information that things like Google Scholar and Google Web Search go out and seek and tap into. So how does it actually do that? So the platform itself, the repository architecture, is designed to be picked up by desired harvesters. And the platform input forms that you fill out when you go to deposit something, they're designed to attempt to optimize the machine readable information, the metadata, for better discovery. Okay, so the auto discovery that machines do between each other, so that you don't have to do the work. You've done the work when you deposited, and then it sort of does all the rest of the work for you. Unfortunately, each harvester has different rules on how it reads the best. And so our job at the libraries is to try and make sure that we optimize the architecture so that you're getting the best discovery for the places that we want research at the University of Manitoba to be found. So some of the harvesters that we are actively partnering with include Google Scholar and Google Web Search. And we're undertaking architecture efforts to improve our discovery with OpenAIRE. And then some aggregators have come online that you may or not be familiar with. So FRDR, Federated Research Data Repository, is the Canadian repository for sort of big data in Canada. And so our data sets and Dataverses in our Dataverse is actually harvested through FRDR discovery. And so if you deposit in our Dataverse, you will actually be found in FRDR discovery. And then a very brand new aggregator called Canada Research, which is set up through McMaster, is looking to sort of harvest a scholarly output housed on the various institutional repositories across Canada, including our M space. So not data deposits, but all of our other scholarly work is hopefully going to be found through Canada Research. So we currently are actively trying to support all of these, as well as, of course, possibly any other crawlers or harvesters such as Crossref that sort of seek out our research. So the key point to understand when you're going to deposit is that to be well discovered, you need to provide as much descriptive information as possible, both in the item itself and the form that requests it in the manner that it requires. And I can't emphasize this enough because we attempt to try and provide some mediated support, but in the end, especially if you're depositing it yourself, how well it's discovered will ultimately come down to you in what kind of information you're providing. So what is metadata? Metadata is that information that is describing the thing that you are depositing, or in more basic ways, the data about data. So you're probably very familiar with the list on the left. Most people are. You read it every day and you just maybe aren't necessarily aware of it. But you know, everything usually has a title. Everything usually has an author or contributors. Maybe not everything has a description. We can talk about that. Most everything, you hope, has a date. everybody likes keywords. And then the access piece, really kind of important. And that's going back to the open, embargo, restricted, metadata only. And then the type. So whether this is a thesis or a technical report or a review or article or a book chapter, all those good things. So that's a basic list of metadata. However, as the audience for research grows and the needs for what people are looking for grow, the importance of this list on the right becomes really important. So starting off with researcher ID, you may or may not be familiar with ORCID. ORCID is the registry for authors or researchers. It has been shown to be very helpful in terms of discovery of your work, as well as showing authority. So who you are is who you are in the digital research universe. So if you've heard about ORCID, but you're not sure whether you should do it or not, or if you're looking for assistance, really encourage you to reach out to your liaison librarian and set yourself up with one and learn how to use it to your benefit. The second point is affiliation. Again, this goes back to authority. And some of these harvesters are starting to actively ask for not only affiliation, but the IDs that correspond to that affiliation. And that can kind of get complicated, so I'm just going to leave that there for now. The third point is sponsors. So sponsors are not necessarily funders. They can be partners. They can have sort of in-kind contributions, whatever kinds of things that you would, want to give some kind of acknowledgement for, but not actually a formal funder. So that would be sort of the sponsor category. And this sort of goes, why would you want to give any kind of bandwidth or whatever to sponsors? Because people want to understand how your research has come about and what are, the influencers or the supporters or whatever of your research. And funders, this is becoming very, very, very important. And so what is required here is the funder name, so the formal name of the funder, the grant name, and the project name. And usually all of these have not only just a name, but they have an identifier with them. And the identifier becomes really important because, again, it's sort of like a shortcut to or a standard way of representing that particular thing. Access, in addition to the 4 key components, access right statement is essentially gives more context around, for example, why you might have it restricted, as an example. And then the final option in this list is language. And this can be important because, of course, if you're looking at something, you maybe want to know whether you can read it or not. So, knowing like what kind of languages are involved in a particular deposit might be helpful for you as a potential reuser to say, oh, I can read that, or I have a translator or whatever. So who's looking at your deposit? Not only are researchers looking at repositories, funders are looking at repositories. More and more funders are interested in knowing whether or not researchers are compliant with their mandates around deposit. And so they look to institutional repositories because they usually say, as a function of getting the grant, that you have deposited in your institutional repository or some other recognized repository. So they want an easy way of checking for that. And so that is who is looking as well, just so that you know. So now we're going to play a game called Could You Describe It Better? And this is to give you some get you thinking about your own deposit and maybe what you do and don't have as part of a description that maybe you can help make better for yourself. So I'm just going to make sure I'm going to make sure that everybody's unmuted, and I'm going to just walk through with you probably first of all what's circled here, and then I'm going to ask you questions. So starting at the top, right here, circled at the top here is the type. So you'll see here that it's an article, and then you have the language. So this particular one, and I should say here that this is a record from OpenAir. So I'm just going to click this just so you can see the actual live record. Okay, yay, this worked. So if you go into the OpenAir search, and I just typed in COVID and I came across this one, sort of the first one, and I thought, this is kind of interesting. So this tells me right here that this is in English. What is not indicated here is that this is not the primary language of the article, which is Bulgarian. And we can get into that in a little bit. Then underneath, you have, of course, the published date. And then you have the publisher, which is Zenodo. So for those of you who are maybe not familiar with Zenodo, Zenodo is another open access repository. Very popular, kind of works with OSF. It's another kind of function like OSF, and a lot of organizations use Zenodo as a sort of an open repository that's sort of not necessarily institutional affiliated. So I'm going to go back to my screenshot. Then you'll see underneath here, under the abstract, and this is all you get for the abstract. And this is your first question. This is very brief, I think, to the point of being unhelpful. So what do you think could be added here? So hopefully I've released everyone's mic. And if you want to anyone, you can sort of see on the right here, the first page. Oh, hello. Turn your mic on. Come on back. Anyone want to say any suggestions about what they could have done with this abstract? Okay, I'll let you mull that over a little bit, and then we can I have a few suggestions. First and foremost, this tells me it's an article, but it doesn't tell me for what or what the purpose of this is. Is this a commentary? Or is this a letter? Is this an editorial? If you read it on the right, because this is the actual document that's actually attached, it doesn't really tell me what this is actually about or who the audience is. And then there's a lot of DOIs attached with this record. There's 9 in total. Doesn't tell me how the other items in related to what is there on the right connects to one another. And then the other final thing that I think is missing is the affiliation, which we can talk about as well. So open air. So there's many related items attached to this main item, which is right here on the right. So unfortunately, it doesn't tell you which is the primary one and which is the related one. But the first one on the list is the actual primary one, and then all of the other DOIs are all the other like versions, whether it's like the English or the Bulgarian version, and as well as the related items. So it's a bit of a mishmash, which again, I guess in terms of just pure discovery is helpful, but in terms of actually understanding or making decisions about what would be useful for you to look at, you actually have to go into each of these Zenodo DOIs to actually have a look. And then finally, you'll see that the medical subject heading is respiratory system. That's not the only subject heading that can be attached to this. And so, for example, the subject heading for COVID would be helpful here. And then in terms of the free text, it looks like what they've done is just pulled out keywords out of the like the full article, which can and may or may not be helpful. Some harvesters do harvest full text like OpenAir does, and so some of these keywords become redundant. And then unfortunately, some of these keywords don't necessarily tell you, again, what the context of this is or what the intent of this article is. So if you're trying to, again, make decisions about whether you should read it or not, it's hard from that keyword list. Okay, so looking at the actual item here on the right, if someone wants to just sort of raise their hand, if they can tell me what metadata they can see on this document. I think at least one of you can tell me. Someone want to raise their hand and let me know what metadata they can see on the document screenshotted on the right. It's called okay. No one wants to volunteer. Okay, starting at the top, you can see that the language, of course, is English, and that it's, but not the primary language. The primary language, of course, is Bulgarian. You can see that from the indication at the top. You can see the title and the subtitle. Title, of course, being COVID-19, the big mistake, and the subtitle being underneath. And then you can see the author here. And I'm not necessarily familiar with the letters beside this person's name. So, which I guess can be an issue in terms of authority. And then there's 2 pages in this article, which would be potentially helpful to know. And then on the second page, which is not screen captured here, there is a reference, but it's not clear whether this article is an answer to that reference or is a source for the article that it's based on. So looking at the item on the right, what metadata is missing? And why is it why because it's missing makes that very important. Anyone want to put up their hand? Okay, well, I will move on then and tell you what I think is missing and explain why that's an important problem for this. So what's missing is the date, the type, the affiliation, the related information. For example, why is there multiple related items indicated in the record of DOIs, but there seems to be no indication of how they relate to this full article here. Page numbers is missing. Authority. So, who who is this person? Where are they from? What kind of expertise do they have? Those kinds of things. So those are just a couple of things. So why is all of these aspects to this a problem? Well, oftentimes as you're going along in the digital universe, you will come across items that have been harvested, separate, or discovered from separated from the records describing it. And so if you were to come across this, just absent outside of the Zenodo metadata envelope, you would have very little context because this article doesn't give you any. And so you would have a very hard time citing this or providing attribution in any way, or even understanding whether you should use it or not. So when you're reflecting on your own material in terms of deposit, it's really important not to fall into these kinds of traps and making sure that you provide the machine readable, not just machine readable metadata, but the human readable metadata beyond just author and title. So before we go to the forum, I just want to talk about the data and Dataverse, and things that you need to keep in mind before you want to just sort of explore depositing data in Dataverse. Dataverse is very interesting. It's not like MSpace. It requires that you have an understanding, like you literally have to build your own envelope to put your data in. So what does that mean? So beyond just creating a Dataverse account, you actually have to create your world, okay? And that can be a little bit disorienting for many people. So beyond getting an account, you need to tell us what you're going to deposit, what size of data that's going to be housed in the Dataverse, what that Dataverse is going to be called, and have some descriptive information so that sort of articulates why somebody should go into your Dataverse to look for something. So it's really important then to have an idea of how you want to structure your data. And that hopefully probably usually reflects what you've done to date if you've built that out, or maybe that can be a little bit more tricky if you haven't really sort of put in that thought yet. But if you're going to sort of explore data deposit and Dataverse, it's really important to have that kind of sort of thinking done. And if it's hard, that's okay. Natalie and I are very used to sort of guiding people through sort of those considerations. And as part of flushing out those envelopes, it's really important to think about the inclusion criteria for each of these the structures here, and have the metadata in your mind or prepared. And second part, which is also a reasonably a common point of confusion for people is understanding how your structure will have influence on the roles and responsibilities for co-investigators in the team. So for example, the administrator usually creates the Dataverse. Um, and then depending on how you want to structure your data, you can have either multiple data sets or you can have a sub-Dataverse. And at each one of these levels, you can provide granular access to people within your team or even outside your team. And that can go all the way down to the file levels. So for example, someone who has access to a file and has a role on the file, that doesn't necessarily translate to the data set, for example, or even other files within that data set. So that's how that those sort of considerations have some uh, interaction with the structure. Okay, so finally, uh, these are some questions that were proposed and answered during our thesis deposit presentation. So I just sort of took some of these and sort of made them a little bit broader because they do more relate in a broader way to sort of all scholarly deposits. So what is the difference between a deposit and a publication? So it's important to understand that a deposit is a form of publishing because of the harvesting and because of the discovery. So if you have a reason for embargo, you can arrange with us to embargo up to 12 months as per your copyright agreement and or the terms of use. So material may also have a restricted or metadata only access, and if you're not really clear about what would be best for you, it's important for you to contact us before deposit. My deposit is multilingual or in another language other than English. What do I do? And in general, our input forms only support one entry, example, primary title, with a supporting field, example, alternate title. For other fields are repeatable, so for example, keywords. So we recommend that the primary language is put in, so for example, if your article is in French and the title is in French, then the primary title should be in French. And then the English would be in the alternate title. We don't necessarily support bilingual or multilingual entries, and so if you're not quite sure how to handle that, we're happy again to provide you some guidance that way. And then for the keywords, you can certainly try and provide some keywords in both languages. Okay, how do I improve discovery or description? Really important to research or prepare your descriptors before deposit. So search how and what appears in a search on the same topic or content as the material that you're waiting to deposit on. And document what you need to input before you go to deposit. And that can also include documentation that may need to accompany your deposit. So for example, README files that may help people to understand for reuse, especially if you're talking about data. For metadata assistance, please contact your liaison librarian. So how do I cite my deposit in future research? Citation elements determined in the style that you're using. So we recommend that you use a citation manager for assistance. Really, really, really important though, to have an availability statement. So for example, if you're depositing in the University of Manitoba MSpace, to say that and provide the link that comes with it. Okay, at this point, the forum is open and I think we have a few questions, Natalie.
Yes. So the first two I provided some answer, but you can let me know if there's anything else I should add to this. So it was, where can I get information about niche repositories related to my research area? I believe you answered this question after it was asked, but I reiterated your recommendation to follow up with you, a liaison librarian, or colleagues within your discipline. I also shared a link to the library's deposit page, which has some information about other national, international, discipline-specific, and multidisciplinary repositories. So that was the first question. I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to add.
I think that's great.
All right. Moving on to the next one. What is the ISO standard for the date? So here, I clarified that it's the largest value to the smallest value you have to record. So if you are just recording the year, then it would just be that 4-digit value for the year. If you were doing year, month, and date, then it would be 4-digit value for year hyphen 2-digit value for month hyphen 2-digit value for date. And hyphens, yeah, between each value. If you do have a specific repository in mind for a deposit, you might want to verify that that is the format they're following. It is the ISO standard, but maybe they have their own format. And then the next question, which I was in the process of answering, can you give me an example of the kind of project that is suitable for Dataverse? So Dataverse can be used for projects where you may be creating anonymized data sets, tabular data, code books, transcripts, and other types of information collected or generated throughout the research project that you need to make accessible in some way. It can be data that you intend to make openly accessible, but it can also be for data where some of it needs to be restricted. And it's particularly helpful if you have a publication where you're citing your data. This gives you a place to point people to so that they can learn more about your data set and potentially access it if your access permissions allow for that. And that is the last question we have so far. I'm not sure if there are any more that are still coming in.
So feel free to raise your hand, and we're happy to release your mic if you want to ask your question sort of over mic. You can certainly continue to sort of read out questions in the question box. While we're waiting for more questions, if there are any, I know that there was a question raised around multi-format, sort of multi-component type of deposits. So it's recommended, at least we recommend, if you have material that are sort of supplementary to your for a deposit in it, for example, in M space, let's say you have deposited an article and there is supplementary material like software or coding or data, it is probably better because that's the kind of thing that we're not necessarily going to sort of encourage deposit of in M space going forward, because there are better homes for that. That would probably reach out to your audience in a better way. So what you would do is you would deposit it there, you would get your DOI or whatever, and then you put the citation to that supplementary information in the like the deposit that you're making to our repository. So that way you sort of refers back and forth, and you get the audience that you need for the supplementary material that you are making available, if that's helpful in any way. Okay, well, if there's going to be no further questions, I think that closes out our presentation. So this recording should be available on the Manitoba Library's YouTube channel in the near future. And so if you have any further questions or you wish to follow up with a consultation, Natalie and myself are more than happy to meet with you. And we hope that you found this presentation helpful, and have a great day.